Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about a celebration of women's history, and especially seeing as we've just had the International Women's Day on March the 8th, which has become a very famous type of day now internationally. But in Ireland, we want to explore what it means for family history and for what family did in historical times and beyond. So we're delighted to have our usual crew, and we also have a wonderful guest with us today from the Seawell program, the Community Wellness Empowerment, Leadership and Life Skills, Helena. So delighted to have Helena with us, and she'll be answering some questions on her projects and so on. And we're going to be looking at some other aspects like voting, the marriage bar, how women were represented on the census in Ireland, and basically what sources we could expect to find for women in the records. So you're all very, very welcome. And I'm going to start with Jack today. And I'm going to ask Jack just a little bit to tell me a little about voting for women in Ireland in the past and just generally what impact that would have for women at the time and so on. So welcome, Jack, and thanks very much for being on the radio show today.
Oh yeah, thanks. So with women's vote and the history behind it, it's very sort of recent enough when it comes to women getting the vote. With a lot of women in countries getting the vote in the being in the 20th century, 1900s. So the important thing to note, like an important term to note when talking about women's vote, is suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote, and an important sort of organization fighting for the rights of women's vote was the suffragette movement. And a suffragette was a member of an activist women's organization in the early 20th century who, under the banner Votes for Women, fought for the right to vote in public elections. And in Ireland, we had a women's suffragette movement in the north of Ireland, founded by Isabella Todd in 1872, which was 11 years before, which they got actually succeeded in getting in Belfast the rights to vote for women. And what this was like big was because it was 11 years before women everywhere else in Ireland got it. So everyone else from 1918, with the rest of the United Kingdom, women in Ireland could vote at age 30 with property qualifications or in university constituencies, while men could vote at age 21 with no qualification. This changed from when they separated to the Irish Free State, which gave equal rights to men and women. So a little bit of why this might have happened was because women had quite a lot of active participation in the 1916 Easter Rising, with the most famous example of the woman influence was Countess Constance Markovich. But an important thing to note there is that despite giving women the right to vote, the Irish Free State was quite monolithic in regards to other civil rights for women. This was because of the Catholic Church influence and Eamon de Valera's sort of opposition to women's rights, which is connected to the Catholic Church. Ireland and the UK giving women suffrage in the 1900s is, like I said earlier, very similar to the rest of the world when it came to suffrage. Most countries gave their women suffrage during this time. For example, Denmark and Iceland gave their women full voting rights in 1915. A notable thing when looking at the history of suffrage is the gradual process entailed in getting women's suffrage. For example, is the US and Australia. It can be seen that they have states or regions granting suffrage like the US state Washington in 1910, or the Australia state like slash region South Australia, which gave universal suffrage in 1894, which Australia and New Zealand as a whole were quite sort of progressive in giving women rights just before other countries in the world, with Ireland and the UK being somewhat slow, but like not as slow as like the rest of the others. And just one more thing that I'd like to talk about is with the gradual process of giving women the right to vote, a lot of like sort of asterisks were attached to a lot of things, where it's like, oh, women could vote if they own property, women could vote if they had university um, um, education, which of course impacted how many women were actually to vote, because it was not common at that time, or not common, but like the amount of women that fulfilled these conditions was not as great, and was intentionally, when it came to like, they were um adverse to giving women the right to vote. I'll pass it back to you, Lorna.
Thank you very much, Jack. That's absolutely fascinating. And your last point of putting in the codicil and the qualification criteria was very, very interesting. And I'm sure very interesting for our listeners on Radio Corcabashna for the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. So thank you for that. Now, Victor, what did you find about women in the census?
Yeah, so I'll just be looking quickly at what way were they portrayed on the census records. So in 1850, the census began to look at individuals as opposed to households, and the census office began to collect, tabulate, and publish statistics on population, manufacturing, agriculture, and mortality. And in the 20th century, census records have produced large amounts of data used by statisticians, government agencies, and academics to better understand the changing role of women, analyze the needs of different demographic groups, and to measure the impact of social programs. So women, just a fact, have made up the large number of census enumerators, so the people who go door to door to fill out the census questionnaires since the late 19th century. Historical censuses records reveal information both about individual women, women in certain communities or demographics, and about women's changing roles in society. But there were always gaps in the censuses. In the early 20th century, censuses gave an incomplete sense of the population of working women. In the 1910 and 1920 censuses, women were recorded as either married or not married. However, the not married section encompassed single women, divorced women, widowers, and women whose husbands had deserted them, which is not the same for men. As women tended to move in and out of the workforce to supplement the family income when required, the census did not always capture the fluid nature of their employment. And census often overlooked women's work done within the home, including piecework, small-scale manufacturing, and services like laundry and cleaning, which was done for the neighbors, generally went unrecorded. Also, women who took in boarders, cooking, and cleaning for them also went unnoticed by enumerators. So for the most part, there was very little detail given to women in the censuses, and the changing of the censuses gives more detail and breathes life into what women went through at that time. So I'll hand it back to you now, Lorna.
Thanks, Victor. And one of the interesting aspects of an academic way of looking at it was the difference and work done by Katrina Clare Clear in NUI Galway was the difference between the 1901 and 1911 census and the difference between what women did. That suddenly in the 1911 census, they were running shops and they were owning shops, and they were kind of able to take over property. And that's the difference, that this kind of small relaxation of rules, even before the vote was given, meant an impact on the ground. And I know that our guest today, Helena, Helena, are you able to come in now to talk to us?
I am. Thanks,
Oh,
Lorna.
fabulous. You're so welcome. Helena has done many projects in and worked. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Helena, your name and your projects and your bits and pieces. We'd really be fascinating to hear, and we're delighted to have you on the Genealogy Radio Show.
It's fabulous to be on with you, and the conversation is so interesting, and I'm delighted to be a guest, so thank you. So I suppose a little bit about myself is my name is Helena Kelly. I'm originally from Crew Park, South Hill, in Limerick, and I suppose the area that I grew up in would be considered a impoverished area and having very little education opportunities or work opportunities for many people. And similarly, where the communities I work in three communities across Limerick, and one that I'm in at the moment today, there's 61% of people would go to second level, and then 5% would only go to third level. And there's a lot of lone parents. 50%, 51% of the community are lone parents, and I suppose that's where I kind of come in and bridging gap, and trying to help be the co-creator for change within these communities and spark that incentive to get back to work and get back to living their lives, and not be just categorized into like a box. And so I suppose
Wonderful.
I think that the inequalities are vast amongst all these communities, and one thing is social justice would be one of my main things that I'd like to do, continue to do, at least amongst these communities. And I find that a lot of the areas are in need of people on the ground, people like myself and yourselves as well. And
Well,
we're trying.
fabulous, and we're delighted, to be listening to you. And you're a wealth of knowledge, and I know you well, and I'm so happy to know you, because your work is fantastic. And I know one of the things we had with this conversation of what we were looking at was you were involved in was it a Bastille Day, or tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm very excited really to be to relive the historical event of Bastille. Well, we call it Bastille Day here in Ireland, but essentially it was for the Treaty of Limerick. Is the Wild Goose Day. We would celebrate the festival, but during the summer. But we got involved essentially because we have a lot of heritage in Limerick, and we value that, and we, as community petitioners, we enhance all these areas, we maintain them, and avoid the council essentially doing this work, because community volunteers, and it's great to get people out participating and involved, and that's how you make conversations and community spirit and pride, and keep everyone kind of going and in the loop and informed. But we thankfully we were invited to King John's Castle for the actual event, but there was a plaque unleashed by the French ambassador, who invited us to the commemoration of the women of Limerick, and it only took place now, believe it. But it was so emotional at the same time. We actually felt that, I felt like, that my heart was right where it needs to be, fighting for, our country and everything that came with that, and all the struggles that people had overcome. And there was plaque eventually unleashed in that day in St. John's 1190 Castle in John Square in Gary.
Lovely.
And there's lots of work kind of going around with the heritage and all the ongoing work. I suppose I'm involved in so many different projects, Lauren. I could kind of go down so many avenues when I'm talking, Judge, So
Oh, and it's lovely to hear, because women of Limerick, it's really, really important to realize just what a major part they had. And we're looking at it where, for our researchers and our family historians, of that they're not, it isn't that they don't exist. And one of the things that we try and do on the Genealogy Radio Show is help inform people of how to find the records and where to find the records. And we've got many famous characters in Limerick, but also women who would have been intrinsically important in dictating the passage of history and so on. And I just suppose sometimes women are forgotten in their roles in history very much, that they're, you know, just how they did fight in sieges, were part of it, were intrinsically part of it, and so on. So it's always important, and it's wonderful to hear about the wonderful kind of commemorations that we have celebrating these relationships and that between the women of Limerick and wider, you know, collaborative practice, because that's often frequently forgotten as well, you know.
Yeah, women are so powerful, and I think that's why we've been during the time before us, you know, women have been held back, and you know, like that, we have the mindset of, you know, you just have to have kids, and you know, that's your place, and you know, all these things are changing. You know, the equality across the board is starting to happen eventually, and we look forward to the day that we're truly equal, because as a woman, and yourself, Lara, I find that we're not equal in the society that we live in today, unfortunately. And you know, it has improved in lots of ways, but it's a very short period of time, and we have a long way to go before we're truly equal.
Fabulous. Yeah, and I think that's what Jack really kind of got to the nub of it very quickly, where he said, okay, the vote was there, but there was a qualifier. You had to be 30, you had to own property, and it wasn't the same for men, because people assumed that women got the vote as they do today, and were able to vote from the same age as today, and without property conditions attached to it. So it's obvious that many people couldn't have voted when the vote was actually released. And actually, Jack, that's the first time I've heard that. So I would consider myself well knowledgeable about this. And so, Jack, you've really done me a great service today. And Chloe, what did you find out about what your research brought you for women's history?
Well, I did more of a focus on the domestic life of women in Ireland.
Very important, the hidden history.
Yeah, so there was a marriage bar which was placed in Ireland in 1932, which restricted the employment of married women in workplace, and specifically in public sectors. So this was a marriage bar was also present in Germany, Netherlands, and the US and UK, with most of them being abolished in the 1950s. But unlike the rest of the world, we only abolished the bar in the 1970s. Beforehand, actually, women were actually promised equal rights to men through the 1922 Constitution, which was written the same year women was given the same rights to vote as men, which was at the age of 21 with no qualification. When in 1918, women were allowed to vote if they were 30 and if they own any property or have a university consensuaries. Eamon de Valera, the Taoiseach at the time, was not actually an avid supporter of women emancipation, so he was more aligned with the church and the church's views. So he was able to get this marriage bar across. So under the marriage bar, Irish women working in public sectors and banks must resign from their jobs once they married, and once married, they can't actually go into work. Another aspect of domestic life was contraception. So in 1935, contraceptions were made illegal under the 1935 Criminal Law Amendment Act until they legalized the sales of contraceptions in 1979 under the Health Family Planning Act, if there was a prescription available. In terms of abortions, which is actually quite a touchy subject in Ireland, it was first written in the Offensive Against a Persons Act in 1861, and which actually made miscarriages a criminal offense, which was subjected to penal servitude for life. The 8th Amendment Constitution Act in 1983 further constrained women in terms of getting an abortion, as it recognized giving an unborn child a right to life the same without their mother. But luckily in 2018, only very recently, women were allowed to have an abortion as with a legal institution, such as when a lot of cases where women were denied the right to abortion, which end up leading to themselves having health issues, including some leading to death.
Okay, so we've seen a lot of changes for women. And Cian, have you anything to add about the celebration of the Women's Day on the 8th of March?
A little bit, yeah. International Women's Day is a global holiday celebrated annually on March 8th to commemorate the cultural, political, and socio-economic achievements of women. It is also a focal point in women's rights movement, bringing attention to issues such as gender equality, reproductive rights, and violence and abuse against women. International Women's Day is commemorated in a variety of ways worldwide. It is a public holiday in several countries and observed socially or locally in others. The UN observes the holiday in connection with a particular issue, campaign, or theme in women's rights. In some parts of the world, International Women's Day still reflects its political origins, being marked by protests and calls for radical change. The 2022 UN theme for International Women's Day is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow, recognizing the contribution of women around the world who are leading the charge on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and response to build a more sustainable future for all.
Well, thank you very much, Cian, and thank you to all our discussion panel today, which was absolutely fascinating because we got a very good picture of what it's like and what kind of contribution and what records that we could expect to find and what kind of topical aspects are around Women's Day. So we're delighted to be able to air this for Radio Corcabashkin and the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. The show is podcast out and repeated, and it's repeated on a Sunday and podcast out as well. We're currently building up our archive from Series 9, and we will have a launch of a digital archive celebrating nearly 8 years of recording the show. So we're delighted. So thanks, folks, for listening and for keeping us all in the loop.